Hi, class. Welcome to Chapter 6. Today we'll be discussing American Jews, the Jewish community that found themselves in the United States. Today's lecture is going to be focusing primarily on, the European sector, the German Jewish experience, the Eastern European Jewish experience, the differentiation between the two. Obviously, the large elephant in the room is going to be discussing the Holocaust in Germany that occurred and how that was affecting 20th century Jewish experiences. And we're actually going to go back as well, just a little bit for a slide or two, and look at some very early on Jewish communities in the United States, going as far back as George Washington. And so we'll have a nice discussion today, and we'll top it off at the very end with a discussion and a documentary on the Jewish community and experience in Hollywood, how they ended up in entertainment, and how the kind of 20th century unfolded for them, right? For glory and riches, and unfortunately in the 50s, under McCarthyism and the Red Scare, started to crumble underneath their feet. So without further ado, let's get started. So some topics to consider for our chapter are: what are the foundational belief systems of the Jewish people and what they believed in? Were they monotheistic, polytheistic? What was their beliefs? Were they persecuted during their time in Europe? If so, how? Were there regional differences between German Jews and Eastern European Jews? How do their experiences differ? And then lastly, once in America, how did the Hollywood moguls of the time adapt and build the movie entertainment industry? Also, how are they also persecuted during the time of McCarthyism? So we'll go through, a wide range of history here and have a general discussion about the community. Hopefully it will be fun and hopefully it will be enlightening. But as an introductory kind of video, if you have a couple minutes of time, this is a decent video from PBS. And so if you have the time, consider watching it. I think it's around like 3 minutes long. So it'll give you a nice little snapshot of early American Jewish communities, and then kind of fast forwarding and migrating throughout the years upwards to the 20th century. And then pretty soon, in a couple months, we're going to have Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year. And so during the New Year, it is a wonderful time of remembrance, because they are, marking the first of the month. It is a remembrance of their exodus from Egypt, right? So, if you are a reader of the Bible and the Old Testament, the Jewish people were, in Egypt under persecution, and then they ended up finding themselves liberated, right, by Moses. And Moses very famously parted the Red Sea, and then they had upwards of, I believe, 40 years, right, of traveling through the desert until they went to the Promised Land, which is supposed to be Israel. According to the teachings of Judaism, and Judaism is very important in old religion because it was the first monotheistic religion of the world. And that is a very, very important thing to consider. For millennia, the world and every single culture around the continents were worshiping polytheistic gods, essentially many gods, right? You had the god of the sun, of the earth, the god of the hearth, the god of thunder, and this and that. But the Jewish people were the first ones to create a monotheistic religion, right? The worship of one God, one almighty, omnipresent deity. And so they are the beginning of what is called the Abrahamic religions under Abraham. And so the three Abrahamic religions are going to be Judaism, and then later Christianity, and then lastly that follows Islam. And so the Jews hold the kind of, mantle of being the first people, the chosen people to worship and believe in the first God. And so, they have a long-standing tradition, right, of understanding the Old Testament and understanding the relationship with God, and that quest for being the, God's chosen people, and, living your life to the fullest, right? Because of your understanding of the persecution that went on for generations, as far back as biblical times, right? And so there is a sense of, for Rosh Hashanah, right, another kind of Jewish celebrated religious holidays, that, there is kind of a, fresh energy that comes in, right, with every new year, but also an understanding of the past, an understanding of the history, and, trying to connect the past and present and understand the Jewish role, right, in the world. And so I thought it was a nice way to kind of start off having a, short discussion about like the history of Judaism, and, how the people, kind of view themselves in the world, especially in relation to biblical times. But let's get into Europe a little bit, because Europe is going to be the main, especially because most of this lecture is going to be primarily in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? So from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Much of it is going to be centered around Europe and the great migrations that followed. And so one of the reasons we have to consider why these great migrations took place is understanding what happened in Europe. And so at the end of World War I, when we had the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. And the Treaty of Versailles was not necessarily too lenient towards Germany. Arguably, every single nation that partook in World War I was at fault for some reason or another. However, the Treaty of Versailles, primarily led by the French forces in France, they wanted to bury Germany. They wanted them to suffer so badly for the war that they ended up within the treaty putting in language saying that Germany is the sole responsible power for World War I, which is obviously not correct. There were so many players, right, in the game. However, they stated that the entirety and the sole blame would go on to Germany, that they would impose heavy penalties of finances on them, and this very quickly caused Germany to go into the Great Depression. And so the war reparations that they had to pay over a number of years totaled 132 billion gold marks. Now, this is not adjusted for inflation, right? This is an enormous amount of money for the time. And it led to Germany having hyperinflation. Now, inflation is something we all hear about in the news. And so what is inflation? Inflation is whenever, over time, the economy naturally grows, but due to various circumstances, right, supply, demand, the strength of the US dollar, etc., over time, things cost more. So for instance, let's say if right now I can buy a Subway sandwich for $5. That's probably not the case anymore, but let's say for the sake of argument, I can buy it for $5 right now. Let's say in a couple of years, that same sandwich is going to cost, let's say, $6.50 or $7. And then 20 years from now, it's going to cost, let's say, $10, something like that. So things over time are going to get more expensive. Most likely, if you talk to any of your parents or grandparents, they'll say the same thing. Oh, when I was your age, gas was 20 cents a gallon. Right now, it's like, $3 something or $4 something in some areas, right? But Germany went into something called hyperinflation. So because the economic situation was so dire, the money was not only increasing in time, right, with how much money you need to purchase one good and commodity, but it was hyperinflating. So in my Subway analogy, let's say the sandwich costs $5 today. With hyperinflation, next month is going to cost $10. The month after that is going to cost $60. The month after that is going to cost $300. So within a couple of months and a few years, right, like the economy is spiraling and the currency essentially becomes worthless. So you need more and more of the currency in order to pay for the same good. And so 1 year after this treaty, Germany needed 48 German marks to equal $1, right? That's the conversion rate, 48 German marks to $1. By 1923, right, only, 4 years after 1919. Within 4 years, $1 was worth over 1 billion German marks, which is insane. So the German marks essentially let me show you here, essentially become worthless, right? They are stacked, by kids. They are useless pieces of paper. And many folks were just putting these German marks on the walls in their apartments, right, for insulation in the winter. They were completely and utterly worthless. Like, imagine you needed a whole wheelbarrow of German marks just to buy like a bread, like a bread loaf, right? It was crazy. But all of this is going to detail us into kind of discussing the Great Depression and why it was important for the rise of Hitler. And so how did World War I lead to World War II? This short history clip might kind of put everything into a bit of context for you. So if you have a couple minutes of time, please watch it, and it'll put things into a little more perspective. But the rise of Hitler was definitely a monumental moment as far as the Jewish community was concerned, because the Nazi Party ended up rising, right? The National Socialist German Workers' Party. And initially, they were supposed to be very kind of democratic and nationalistic, right? Or socialistic, I should say. But, very quickly, their policies of socialism, because things were in such a dire economic strait, they quickly turned to extreme nationalism. Something called pan-Germanism, which is all the Germanic people around the world are going to have an understanding that they are all of a singular German race. You could say the same thing with anyone else. Let's say Pan-Africanism. All African descendant people around the world would have one common unified, let's say, mentality. And so Pan-Germanism with extreme nationalism, the love of your country and the love of Germany, was put up into the forefront. Now, the missing ingredients that Hitler ingeniously created here was when the country is in economic devastation and everyone is reeling back from the hardships, right, that the economy is worth nothing. And even worse so, that only a few years before, right, during World War I, they were still, as Germany goes, one of the most powerful nations in the world, right? They were, they had a right to be a very proudful people. They had a very strong economy, a powerful military, right? Science and literature and art was through the roof. And then within a few short years, they are bastardized by the other powers and said, no, World War I was completely your fault, et cetera, et cetera. And so now they're in the midst of a Great Depression. And so with those ingredients, Hitler now introduces anti-Semitism, saying to many of the Germans, no, it is the Jews. It is their fault, right? That all of this has transpired. And so, Adolf Hitler, with his rhetoric, soon rises to power as Chancellor of Germany, and he is democratically elected. Many people kind of fail to remember that, but he was democratically elected by the people. The people voted him into power. He didn't, perform a coup d'etat. And so he very quickly became the Fuhrer and kind of, started to rule with an iron fascist fist. But during his years as a teenager, one of his important anti-Semitic works was his personal writings while he was in prison. Now, after before World War I came to a close, he was a teenager. He was, in the military, and eventually, once he got out, he started going to prison because of his political views and rallies that he was holding, right? And so he was advocating for German reunification, military expansion, economic development, pushing back against other nations, and blaming, of course, the economic downturn on the Jews, because they were the ones who were, at the time, controlling much of the banking industries within Europe. Now, for all of you Illuminati conspiracy theorists, there is a reason why the Jewish communities were kind of more closely linked with banks. And this goes back to hundreds of years during the Crusades. Because, as Europe centuries ago, right, during the medieval ages, as they were completely steeped in Catholicism and the worship of God, one of the tenets was that it was considered very unclean for you to handle and trade and barter with money. At that time, it so happens, the Indo-European Jewish families were moving and migrating into Europe at the time from Eastern Europe and Romania regions, right? They were kind of traveling and migrating through. And so they happened to stop within Europe, and, essentially they're like, oh, we'll just give this dirty job of handling money to the Jews, right? They're not Christians. They don't have to, follow the same beliefs as us. Give it to them. But the thing is, that was the greatest gift they could have given the Jewish communities, because the banking industry was born. Interest was born. And for any of you that look outside towards these large, tall banking towers, right, it's a very lucrative business. And so once the Great Depression started to happen centuries later within Germany, a lot of the Germans, who were once very proud people, started to look at their home country and say, our country is devastated, our economy is shot, we are starving, we have no money, but there's the Jew over there, right, who owns the bank. And they're still living pretty well, and they're still eating caviar, and they're still dressing nicely. It's because, they were, saving up their money and investments and had jewelry and gold and whatever else to barter with, right? Because they were working in the banks. It was really lucrative. Obviously, not every single Jewish person was a bank owner, but the community itself was pretty strong, right? Financially and economically. And so as soon as Hitler started to come into power, he started to pass various forms of legislation, such as the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, which started to exclude Jews from citizenship and banned intermarriage between Germans and Jews. And so the first viewpoints that we get that the Jewish people within Germany have been started to get discriminated against is that you are barring citizenship from them and telling them they cannot intermarry with your population. Hence, like discrimination and segregation 101. And so that was the first kind of major flaw we had. Now, this is a fun little video, informative video, of the story of Mein Kampf, which is, what we discussed in the previous slide. But this is a story from, this is an interview between Rick Steves, which the guy's living the life. So he essentially just travels the world and writes books about traveling. So if you want to travel to France, he's been all through France, and he has like a Rick Steves book of places for you to go and see, etc. But he interviews a German here, right, a historian, and they're talking about Mein Kampf, right, his writings within prison of, everything is the Jewish conspiracy, everything is the Jews' fault. Of course, in conjunction with talking about his views of the world and the war and such. But they go into, more detail here about what the writing entails. And essentially what the German gentleman is saying is like, a lot of it was kind of gibberish. Many of the German folks, they had a copy of it because it's Hitler's famous Mein Kampf copy, but a lot of them kind of gave up after the first few pages because it's just him like ranting and ranting and ranting. Very similarly, if you have ever seen one of your friends post like a 3-page long Facebook post, you'll read the first 2 sentences and the rest you're just like, I don't have time for this. But, Hitler did serve in the armed forces of Germany, so that's where a lot of his pride and nationalism ended up coming forth. And so once he started to see his beloved Germany go down under, he wanted to obviously change that. Now, interestingly enough, when he was younger and before he got into politics, he wanted to be a painter, he wanted to be an artist, but he was rejected from art school. So I guess the theory here is, or the lesson to be learned is, accept everyone into art school, let them paint, let them have the therapeutic painting, magic. Maybe they won't go into politics. But as time goes on, and we're only, 3 years after the Nuremberg Laws, we start to see the very famous Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And this was a very famous kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish movement carried out by many of the German folks, alongside with some of the paramilitary forces and some of the early SS from the Nazi Party. And so it was a very organized 2-day, kind of rioting where all the stores that were Jewish owned were looted and vandalized. And so imagine yourself like this poor gentleman over here, right, with his broom, and he has to, clean up all of this broken glass. So imagine for yourself, you wake up one morning, and of course Mein Kampf is being proliferated all throughout Germany, and you're thinking to yourself, well, okay, Germany is a very enlightened, intelligent country, right? This guy is just a one-off crazy. They're not going to do anything with him. Lo and behold, he becomes Chancellor of Germany. And then very soon afterwards, right, you come to your business in the morning, and there are, very kind of slogans painted, right? Jews. So everyone knows this is a Jewish business. And then very slowly after that, folks are posting up, signs such as, get out of here, Jews, right? Or this is a Jew business. And then the military forces, alongside with the SS forces, are really doing nothing about it. If anything, they're putting little postcards on top of it, trying to support the movement. And then very shortly after that, things devolve into, right, your store being vandalized, broken into, mirrors shot, products stolen, and of course you go inside and all hell has been unleashed. And so a lot of these communities were, under fire, under threat. And for anyone who was savvy enough or scared enough to see what was going on at this time, they got the heck out of Europe. And for those who unfortunately had the foresight, or not the foresight, excuse me, for those that had the optimistic viewpoint that Germany was going to come to its senses, unfortunately that ended up not happening. Because as soon as Hitler started to rise more and more in power, he ended up getting what was called his final solution, right? His final solution to the Jewish question of what to do with the people. And in his final advocation, what he started to write in Mein Kampf, stating such as the Jews are responsible for the economic downturn of our country. The Jews are a conspiracy theory, and they control all the banking systems, and they put down everyone else. The Jews are rats who are not fit or destined to live on this earth, and in my final solution, I will exterminate them. And so we have the beginning of the horrific event of the Holocaust, a genocidal cleansing of the Jewish population. And so, this was a rounding of approximately 6 million folks of Jewish descent, and gypsies on top of that. Not just Jews, but gypsies as well. Plus more than 1 million other undesirables. So Jews, gypsies, typically a lot of disabled individuals, right, or mental disabilities. And so they're all riled together and started to get exterminated in these various extermination camps. And as soon as the war ends, because we're not going to get too heavily into this, but as soon as World War II ends, and the Soviet troops especially are marching across Europe, the Soviet troops are stopping by on a lot of these extermination camps, right? And recording what they saw, and having pictures and seeing people that are literally half starving and they're just sticking bones. And so there's so much evidence, right, to say that yes, this was true, this was happening. Unfortunately, the Armenian genocide a number of years earlier, in 1915, 30 years before that, was not as well evidenced or documented. So even today, a few states don't recognize the Armenian genocide. But at this stage for the Holocaust, it was pretty much undeniable what had happened. And so immediately after World War II ends, we start getting the Nuremberg trials. And they are nicknamed the Nuremberg trials because of the original Nuremberg laws that Hitler passed of no intermarriage between them, and they can't have citizenship, etc. And so the Allied forces very quickly, under international law, round about all of the top kind of officials. Where is it? Yeah, they round up all of the top officials and put them on trial. Everyone from the SS to people involved in the camps, etc. And they wanted essentially to make a very public and international show to say unilaterally, we do not agree with genocide, and this is not okay under international law. We will prosecute you, right? It was a very public statement to make. Now, here we have the story of a Holocaust survivor. So get your tissues out, because some parts of this are, pretty deep, right, to listen to. But Mr. Shipper over here has a, almost unbelievable story. So if you have around, I believe the video is around 10 minutes long, something like that. It is a very emotional viewpoint onto the story of a Holocaust survivor, and how he gets somehow through the concentration camps, and somehow makes it back to England whenever the Allies finally kind of save him and everyone else at the camp. So definitely worth a watch if you have some spare time. Yeah, so the Nuremberg trials unfolding. Now the St. Louis question. So this is a moment in U.S. history, one of many, that the Americans are not proud of. So the St. Louis was a big luxury cruise ship in 1939. It left Germany to go to Havana, Cuba, and it was carrying many Jewish passengers. Now, the U.S. passengers wanted to get to the States. They wanted to get to Cuba or anywhere else, right? Because they wanted to get the heck out of Germany. They were the ones who were seeing the impending doom. However, the United States was imposing immigration quotas on any incoming Jews. So the plan was to for them to stop by Havana, Cuba, and then go to Florida shortly afterwards. But however, the shipmasters kept telling the ship that you cannot dock. We will not allow you because we have the quotas. And so the ship was pretty much just stagnant and sitting there. And so, all of these, thousands of people on the ship packed were not able to enter the United States. And so this entered into very heated debate overnight around the world, because the United States was saying to the world, we do not want these refugees. We do not want them as incoming immigrants. And especially, right, the debate intensified because they are fleeing Nazi Germany and Hitler's, a very kind of cruel rise to power. So folks around the world are starting to hear what Hitler intends to do. And so it resulted in the United States turning them away. But Cuba, Britain, France, Holland, Belgium, all of them felt bad for, this entire situation. So they collectively started to say, we'll take some of them. We'll take 500. We'll take 1,000. We'll take 2,000 of them. But the United States and Canada both rejected them. And then the St. Louis trip was nicknamed the Voyage of the Damned, because essentially, as soon as you left Germany at this time, and you sold all of your belongings and you were Jewish, and you made it to the States, or you made it to the Caribbean, if the ship has to go back to Germany because nobody accepted your entry and they rejected you entirely and said, you just go back to Germany, we're having quota limits. If you go back to Germany, you're automatically dead. So that's why it was nicknamed the Voyage of the Damned, because they have literally no place else to go. In a Nazi editorial within Germany, they said, "We are openly saying we do not want the Jews, while the democracies keep claiming that they are willing to receive them and then leave the guests out in the cold. Aren't we savages better men after all?" So this was a very meaningful critique underneath the Nazi kind of regime, because they were essentially saying that we are being in our open prejudice, right? Very open with the world. We are openly and having our heart on our sleeves, just saying, listen, we don't want the Jews here. But the West is a bunch of hypocrites. The West is saying we are a democracy. We are open to immigration and the acceptance of people, and yet you are turning them away, right? And so this is a very kind of like stinging points that Nazi Germany had against the United States and Canada at that time. And so the St. Louis, very reminiscent to kind of like a Titanic version, if anything else, is housing so many folks that just want to get the heck out of Germany for a better life. And so it has, families that want to live, families that want to prosper in a nation that is not going to, persecute them, right, for their religious beliefs and their bloodline. Now, the St. Louis question here, on the left-hand side, we have a discussion about Canada making a public apology to the families and saying, we're sorry for turning you away. And on the right-hand side, we have a survivor that recalls the voyage of the damned, right, all these years later. And he actually ends up coming back and living in Florida, right, once he is able to, because as a young child, once he saw Florida, because they were so close, right, but they didn't let them on. Once he saw Florida, he essentially, said, if I ever make it out of this one, I'm going to come back and live here. And he ended up living there. I believe Miami Beach, actually. Now, let's have a conversation about the different Jewish experiences in Europe at the time, and kind of, having an overall conversation of like the differentiations in Europe that they have. So very early forms of, let's say Jewish experiences in Europe, going back centuries towards that crusading medieval time period I was telling you about. All throughout Europe, they were being persecuted at various times. Not always, right? They were living there and working just like anyone else, but during various moments of kind of religious fervor, when Christianity and Catholicism really kind of riled up, we have the Spanish Reconquista, or the Reconquest. And so under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, they were very religious. They were highly Catholic. They were actually, interestingly enough, the ones that were funding a lot of the expeditions, such as Christopher Columbus. But that's neither here nor there. They were very religious, and they wanted to drive out of Spain all of the Moors. Moors are, any non-Christian, but essentially for them, Moors were Jews and Muslims. So half of Spain at that time was populated by Muslims, Jews, Gypsies, anyone else. And the northern half was more Christian. And so they essentially started an entire war campaign to cleanse Spain of these people and thrust them out. And so because of this, a lot of the Jewish populations were scattered, and they ended up going to Italy, North Africa, Russia, Brazil, Dutch West Indies, America. And so, the diaspora people of the Jews ends up being that, a diaspora, right? They started living in various parts of the world. However, with the understanding that they are part of the Jewish collective, right? They are all Jewish at birth and through bloodline and through religious belief. But we had some left over in the West Germany region because the Jewish populations were still all throughout Europe here and there. So we have the Ashkenazi Jews on the West German Rhine River bankland. And so there is some debate even today as to let's say, the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews versus the others. Because, there's some debate over heritage, lineage. There's some DNA evidence going on around here and there, but we won't get into all of that. But for the sake of argument, the Ashkenazi Jews, their during this time, current homeland was West Germany in the Rhine River. And they were, very, of course, in depth with their culture, their ideas that they were descendant from Babylon and the Holy Land itself. And eventually, once again, religion rears its ugly head under Catholicism. Pope Paul IV began massive persecutions of them, forcing them to wear identifying symbols. And in Poland, Ukraine, and all throughout Europe, they started to slaughter thousands of Jews because, once again, this uplifting of religious fervor, saying that Catholicism is number one, Christianity is number one, Muslims, Moors, Gypsies, Jews, all of them, they are secondary, right? Once you start to proliferate that kind of rhetoric, it leads to very dangerous consequences on the ground. Now, those Jews that found themselves very early on, right, such as after the Spanish Reconquista, going to the States and to America, right, or North America in general, some of them even as early as the colonial days, found it actually very pleasant. So imagine yourself, you are coming from Europe, which is discriminating you left and right for being Jewish. But America and the United States was pretty, lax, right? Freedom of religion, right? They were kind of much more comfortable there. And so Calvinists at the time liked them very much because they were Hebrews. They were people of the Old Testament, right? So they could relate to them on that front. And they both hated Roman Catholicism because the Jews were persecuted by the Roman Catholics. The Calvinists were persecuted by the Catholics as well. So they both had that mutual understanding of like, my brother, right? We both went through hell. And the main point here was that they were expelled from Europe for their religious beliefs, had to flee their home country, and as far as the United States goes, they had to start a new life, right, in a foreign land. But the German Jews in general, and there's a difference between Ashkenazi Jews, German Jews, and Eastern European Jews. Those are like three different sects. So we just started in Spain with them being persecuted and run out. We migrated east a little bit towards the west bank, the Rhineland River of Germany. Those are the Ashkenazi Jews. Now we're going to look at the German Jews, right, kind of central Germany region. And then we're going to go all the way east to Eastern Europe and Russia, right? So that's kind of like the spread, if you will. And so the Jews in Germany at the time had probably the best experience. Anything pre-Hitler, they had an amazing experience in Germany, which is why a lot of them and their families were staking it out in Germany at the time, because they thought, well, this Germany has been very kind to us, right? Typically, it was not a bad deal here. And so, historically and traditionally, they were, like I said before, they were able to enter into commerce and business because centuries ago, the Christians told them, we don't want to deal with money. You be the bankers of the world. They're like, okay. They became the merchants and financiers. So what initially was their main strength and success as a community, later on, due to Hitler, would end up being their downfall and used against them. But Germany at the time, throughout the 1800s, was having their own renaissance, so to speak, right, of intellectualism, of reforms, and scientific innovation. And so many in the community were, having a wonderful time during this sort of like German Renaissance. And, many in the community were also looking at and reading all of these reform movements, these philosophers, these Enlightenment thinkers that were going away from religion and going closer towards, let's say, secularism, and going more towards viewing the world in a very realistic manner aside from religion and God. And so a lot of Jews started to, read and get educated in a lot of these Enlightenment views and started to kind of go away from a very strict observance of the faith, because this can happen for anyone. This can happen to Christians, anyone the worshippers of Islam or Judaism. There is a very strict interpretation of, let's say, the Bible or the Torah, saying every single thing that is written in there is law. It is true. Versus others that say the Bible or the Torah is a nice piece of guidance for me of how to live my life, but I'm not going to 100%, let's say, follow it. And so many here were saying that Judaism was, merely kind of a tool to interpret the world, right? Not needing for it to be very strictly observed. And so, Isaac Wise, for instance, in 1989, established the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And so he was trying to reform Jewish life, prayer, and traditions, synagogue segregation, and even translating the Torah from ancient Hebrew to German, right, to make it a lot more accessible for them to read. And so the main explanation here was that the Torah is not a literal explanation of reality, but a symbolic reading and a guide for how mankind should go through the world with greater ethical values. And so many of these folks were also early on rejecting Zionist notions, and we're going to get into Zionism towards the end of the lecture and what that means. But Zionism is essentially this early held idea or belief that all Jews should go back to Israel and have their own homeland and state, right? Because at this point in time, they're all just dispersed around the world. They don't have an actual state or country to themselves. But many in Germany at this time were rejecting the notions of creating the state of Israel because they wanted peace and justice, right? They just wanted a normal life and have peace. And they were saying that if we have to, let's say, go back to Israel in the Middle East, that's going to cause a lot of issues for us. Many people who were in America at the time said, we don't want to go anywhere. America's already very kind and generous to us, and we're being successful, right, in our communities and business. So why should we leave? So the main point of all of this within Germany is that Enlightenment and Reformation and all those ideals impacted the Jewish community greatly. They started to help them with their worldview, science, progression, and also not necessarily focusing on their hardships throughout life, but focusing on, building their community and living a good life. Now let's focus on Eastern European side. The Eastern Europeans, unfortunately, under the Russians, had a pretty rough go of it. But the identity of the people here living in Eastern Europe were of a very faith-based people. The synagogue under the Yiddish language is very important to them. And they had fierce cultural preservation because of all of their past trauma and persecutions in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans also started to really hammer down the points that Jewish faith had to mean that you needed to marry only Jews. So keep it within the family, keep it within the bloodline. And interestingly enough, in a very Jewish tradition, you were only considered Jewish if your mother is Jewish. The reason for that is, in a very historic way, before DNA testing was a thing, the only way that they could 100% confirm that you are Jewish is if you have witnesses and they see that you came out of your mother. So that's very early DNA testing. So if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish. However, if your father is Jewish or supposedly Jewish, we have no idea. We can't prove that, right? But they had a very singular, vision of the time-space continuum. Eastern European Jews saw time as one long linear time stream, right? As many of us do in the West right now, in a very Judeo-Christian manner. Their creation was, of Judaism, that they were the children of Abraham, hence the Abrahamic religions, the three of them. And it led them to believe that they were the central characters in the human experience, right? Because if you are being told from the cradle that you are God's chosen people, right? You are the first people that God communicated with on this earth. That comes with a very special understanding, right? And kind of helps you get through life in a better way. But under Russian rule, the Russian Empire was pretty fierce towards them. The czars attempted to have peace as much as possible. However, and the reason that they attempted to have peace in their country is because when you have a very large empire, it is a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious region. You have many different peoples living under the empire, but you rule them all. And so the Russian czars had a responsibility to ensure that every kind of religious group was taken care of. Otherwise, the other groups might say, this life isn't really great here, right? Why are we doing this? However, after the death of Alexander II, when he was assassinated in 1881, we start to see that without a strong kind of central character up top, we start to see an increase in hate crimes, murders, and massacres within Eastern Europe, especially within the Russian Empire, of Eastern Jews. And so they start to obviously flee the country, right? Because they are searching for a better life and better treatment. So by 1910, we had more than 500,000 of Eastern European Jews living in New York. And in following years, we would get a couple more million of them finding their way to the States as well. And so many were finding early on, as they came to the United States, kind of like a humble solace that they were poor. They came here with no money and were fleeing persecutions. But the number one thing that they kept telling themselves is, for greater success, we must be educated. And we must send our children and grandchildren for education too, because they were a very pragmatic people. And so they understood that in order, let's say, to get those higher level jobs, we need education, we need degrees, right? We want our sons and daughters to be lawyers, doctors, engineers. And so children of these Jewish communities ended up growing with the understanding that education equals success. And so the main point of all of this was the Eastern European Jewish communities learned how to live within this kind of larger imperial rule. But because of the kind of roughness of the Russian Empire after the death of Alexander II, they developed a very rugged and pragmatic view of the world. And so they were very practical. They came to the States and was like, all right, well, we're going to work our butts off. And then they look at the kids and like, you're going to college, man. You're going to get a degree and you're going to be a doctor because we need money in the family. This is a wonderful video of Russian and Eastern Jewish, migrations, and how they ended up getting into the various positions and jobs that they were, and also how musically they ended up getting into more of the kind of like music industry. So very fascinating video if you have a few minutes of your time. And this is a hilarious first impression video that I love to put in, because like years later, in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapses, we have this gentleman. He is Russian Jewish, and after the Soviet Union collapses, he leaves for America, and he has this hilarious like viewpoint interpretation, because for all of those years, everyone, him also especially, he's just like, oh, America, right? It's so talked up, and everyone's like, America's a land of freedom and opportunity and all of these different things. And so he was imagining to himself like a golden paradise. The cities are beautiful and clean, and there's so much work and prosperity everywhere, and it's just amazing. And so the last time he was in Russia was in Moscow, right, for the airport. But within Moscow, you have these beautiful subways, right, lined with gold, right, just immaculate marble gold. It looks like a palace. And then he came to New York, and he was in the New York subway train, and it just kind of like looks dungy. There's graffiti everywhere. There's trash, and he's just like, "This is America." And so it's a hilarious first impression video. So if you have time, just just view it. You might get a chuckle out of it. But definitely from Eastern Europe, we had so many wonderful folks come in. We had polymaths come in, scientists, we had musicians come in, and all of these folks ended up definitely getting into their own various businesses and, creating strong communities, right, as such. Some definitely had better experiences than others, right? Some were part of the military, some were successful, businessmen, had their children go to school within the Russian Empire. And so the Jewish experience was not completely all bad, but the stigma was still there, right? And so as, some of them were having more success and hopefully got out earlier rather than later, others were not so fortunate in the various Ukraine, Poland, and Russia massacres that unfolded. So as much as there was some stories of good, there were also plenty of stories of bad, unfortunately. So a divided house. So this is once America starts to grow and flourish with the Jewish communities. And in the United States, we have a healthy sized population of German Jews and a healthy sized population of Eastern European Jews. How did both of them fare? How do they assimilate? How do they view each other? The German Jews advocated for rapid assimilation as soon as they came here. We have to assimilate. We have to be Americanized. And they were trying to phase out their Yiddishness, supporting the Republican Party and advocating being good citizens, being American. They started to go more into business ownership. And, as business owners, they wanted to keep wages low and profits high. So they came here and they wanted to be business moguls, and they wanted to work, right, hard. And the takeaway was that Americans liked this group very much because they were more similar to them, right? They were even more kind of German-esque, culture, right, which was a little closer to the Americo-Angling culture. And because they were advocating so heavily for this assimilation, acculturation, it was much easier for them to incorporate themselves into the American communities and ethos. Conversely, the Eastern European Jews, because of all the persecution that they saw in the hands of the Eastern Europeans and the Russians, they were fiercely advocating for keeping their Yiddish culture. They did not like cultural imperialism because they had spent so many years under kind of oppressive regimes and governments telling them, you must change, we don't like you because you're Jewish, you have to be, let's say, Christian, etc., etc. And so they did not want to necessarily reform themselves. They wanted to maintain their old world connections and ties and values, but at the same time live in America. And so instead of many of these folks, let's say, owning the factories and businesses right out during the get-go, many of them saw themselves working in the factories instead, but wanted to establish unions for protection, right, against getting fired or such. And so the takeaway for Eastern European Jews is that Americans were discriminating against them in large numbers, right, as soon as more and more of them started to pour in. They started discriminating them because of some of their, let's say, early financial struggles, and especially because of their old world ways. And so within the United States, at least in the first early years, in the early 1800s and early 1900s, the German Jews saw better success, right? This is a nice little, pit stop. There's a, long-standing history of, some Jewish communities in the United States. The very first example we have, one of the first examples, is from Moses. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Sexas? So he was in charge of the congregation of the Kahal Kadosh of Israel, better known as the Hebrew Congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. And he actually wrote a letter to George Washington, because George Washington had ridden through their town and met with a lot of the Jewish community and the leaders. This is in 1790, right? This is like close to the early founding of America, right? True, like America. And so, he was expressing his and the entire Jewish community's esteem for the president, and wanted for him to understand that it was his great joy that the God of Israel had protected King David, but is also now protecting George General Washington, and that the same spirit resided in him, right? It was now bestowing its grace onto George Washington himself. And so, this was a nice early interaction between the early Jewish communities and George Washington himself. But it also shows that, the Jewish people were in the United States not merely just in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They've been here for a while. But when I'm focusing on the 18 and 1900s, is because that's when most of them ended up coming over in the Great Migrations, right? And here's Mr. Moses himself, Moses Sextius, and the famous letter that he penned for George Washington. So, what was the overall consensus of the Jewish communities between Europe and the United States as time goes on? And they are writing letters to each other and trying to decide, should we stay in Europe? Should we move to America? Throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, many Jews were facing prejudice in the U.S., not as much, but still having some prejudice from holding, let's say, political office, because that was a very Protestant white position to own. Having various expulsion orders here and now again, and some social exclusions from the communities. However, they still thought that America was much better for the Jews to live in, because although they had some of these tiny restrictions here and there, it paled in comparison to the restrictions and the persecutions they were having in Europe. In Europe, for instance, they had blatant prejudice, punishing taxes, economic and political restrictions, and at the very worst of it, massacres and killings. The United States, although they had some prejudice in a very kind of lower form, right, they could still have the freedom to worship and build their synagogues. They were actually getting some tax exemptions for being a religious institution. They had to, incorporate some associations legally, right? And they were building more of a civic lifestyle for themselves in peace, because there was rule of law and there was freedom of religion and all of these things. So essentially in Europe, blatant racism / potential misfortunate killings and massacres. Not every single occasion, but at the very worst of it. United States, lower form of prejudice and an opportunity for you to blend in and live your life in peace. So as far as all of that goes, the United States was clearly the better choice for many of them. And so, like we said later, many folks from Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, were later coming in the hundreds of thousands, and if not the millions. And so the main point here is despite nativism once again being the local native populations, let's say Americans, are very ambivalent towards immigrants and immigration and the other coming in. But despite nativism, many Jews were rising in economic opportunity, had legal protections under the Bill of Rights, and grew to see the United States as their home. And some of them discounting any other Zionist notions of, let's say, building the state of Israel in the Middle East and saying, United States for us is the promised land, right? We have found our home. Now, 20th century Jewish communities were growing in importance. So from the 20s to the 40s, many were still holding their faith that the United States is, right, the land for them. Many were voting for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, for supporting the New Deal. Many were seeing themselves as having an exceptional future for their children and grandchildren in the U.S., and kept confirming all of these notions because in Europe, their European cousins were having their communities destroyed. And many that were born in the United States now, right, the Jewish folks born in the U.S., they started to see themselves as being lucky of being born in the U.S., right, or being an accident of geography, as they like to call it. Post-World War II, we start to see truly more of like the rise of Hollywood. Hollywood, and we'll get into this towards the later slides because there's a wonderful documentary that I put on. But the early 1900s saw the rise of Hollywood and filmmaking through Jewish writers and filmmakers and cartoonists. And I'll talk about this in more detail, but as we're getting closer towards World War II, eventually the U.S. government gets involved and says, hey, listen, Hollywood, please start making very upbeat, patriotic movies. We need you. And so they start to really become ingrained with the American culture and ideal because they are now the entertainers of America and have these wonderful patriotic movies and messages. And so as the Jewish communities are growing off from prosperity, they are starting to get a little more well off versus other minority groups, showing that they are very, beneficial, right, of all of this prosperity and opportunity in the United States. Later on, during the 60s, they actually become very involved in civil rights marches and helping the African Americans to fight their legal battles with the civil rights movement because they understand what persecution means. And they understand that they themselves are getting the benefit of legal protections in the United States. And so they wanted to help others to get that same legal protection. And so some early Hollywood-esque, right, Jewish communities start to form and others, right? But they still do not forget their heritage. Although we will have more of a discussion on this towards the end of the lecture. But over time, we start to see that the Hollywood moguls, right? A lot of the big studios had essentially, right, a lot of Jewish, moguls leading the studios. And then, here we have a quote from An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. The Hollywood Jews created a powerful cluster of images and ideas, so powerful that, in a sense, they colonized the American imagination. Ultimately, American values came to be defined by the movies the Jews made. And this is a very true statement, and we're going to get into a deeper discussion of this in a few slides with the documentary I'm going to show. Or if you have time to watch it. It's like an hour and 40 minutes, but it's a really good one. And so as the 20th and 21st centuries unfold, entertainment and the music industry grows like never before. And arguably, this is one of the greatest impacts that the Jewish community had on the United States and the world, because the music and especially the movie industry today is so large and so overreaching and expansive. And every single one of us love to turn on Netflix and Hulu and watch a movie or go to the movie theaters, right? Have some popcorn and date night. And so over the years, they've had these cult hits. Dracula, Snow White, Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Jaws, E.T., Indiana Jones, Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, etc. It goes on and on and on. But all of these movies have kind of proliferated themselves into the American mindset, the cultural mindset of not just us, but the world. And they've created this notion of, right, the ideal American dream, this notion of anything could happen in America if you work hard enough. Because previous to this, the American ideal of the American dream was not really a thing. It was not stated. Yes, America had freedom and you could have good opportunity and work there, but it was the movies that made this possible, right? The movies that made these kind of patriotic themes of Americanization and America and the land of the free and the American dream, and showing you on the big screen that if you work hard enough, you can have a beautiful family and a house and a white picket fence and the Corvette in the driveway if you want. And so we'll get a little bit more into this with the documentary slide. For any of you who are of Jewish blood and birth, Birthright Israel might be something you can look into. This is a nonprofit organization started in 1999 and sponsors a free 10-day voyage, a 10-day trip to Israel for young adults between 18 and 32. I'm pretty sure the age range has not changed. Maybe they would have bumped it up to 35 recently, but I'll have to double check on that. But for those of you still in college, if you are of Jewish heritage, and I believe they require some type of like proof somehow, I'm not exactly sure, but it allows for you to essentially, fly to Israel and have a 10-day heritage trip. They show you around, they show you the most important sites, and you have this wonderful experience to kind of get in touch with your Jewish roots. So it might be something for you to think about. And so if you look at this video for Birthright Israel, you can have, these alumni stories, right, of folks who have been on the Birthright trip and they absolutely loved it. But let's talk about this documentary that I found. It's called Hollywoodism, Jews, Movies, and the American Dream. Now, it's from 1998, and so some of you might see it as a bit of an older documentary, and it definitely is, but some of the points are still coming across nicely. Now, I stumbled across this recently, and I gave it a watch, and it has a very interesting angle as far as our class and our discussions of ethnicity, identity, heritage. A lot of these Jewish communities that made their way to Los Angeles and Hollywood, they started getting into film. And especially in the early days of Hollywood, they were very fearful, as the documentary says, they were very fearful of showing that they were overtly Jewish. Because, once again, they came from Europe with all of the prejudice and discrimination. And if you're making movies, you are now in the spotlight. And so this documentary does a great job, I think, of showing them getting into the movie industry and becoming powerful movie makers and narrative storytellers. And throughout all of that, as they're making these like cult classics and hits of movies and TV shows and all of these famous movie stars that eventually, most of them changed their name from Jewish last names to more American last names, right? So not overtly Jewish, right? They are American actors, American movies. They're not Jewish on the screen. As they're making all of these movies, they are feeding into the patriotic machine of America, especially during the World War II days. But it's an interesting discussion because they are trying to portray themselves and all of the Jewish actors that they're hiring and forcing them to change their names to Americanized names. They are kind of having this very Americanized change and viewpoint of themselves in the community. But at the same time, they don't want to seem overtly Jewish for fear of persecution. And in doing so, they gained an immense amount of wealth and fame and influence within the industry, as we saw with all of those like studio heads, right? And at the very end of the documentary, it shows, unfortunately, that same thing that kind of built up this entire notion of the American dream and all these wonderful movies they were cranking out, eventually it turned against them because during the 50s, right? With the Red Scare and the Cold War, McCarthyism came out like crazy. Senator McCarthy was going on a blitzkrieg of like pointing fingers and saying like, you're a communist, you're anti-American, you're this and that. And then he pointed his finger at Hollywood and said that Hollywood is, not what they seem. And essentially what they were trying to say, and they'll show this in the documentary, but essentially in all of the congressional court hearings that they had with the representatives and the lawyers from Hollywood, they ended up trying to make the argument of, oh, you're Jewish, oh, you're from Eastern Europe, oh, that's close to Russia, and Russia is communist, so therefore you might be communist, right? They're trying to go like one sequence after another. And so it was a very interesting, thing to watch, right? This kind of like rise of Hollywood and their influence on movies and the American dream and everything else. So if you have some time, this is obviously a very longer documentary. It's like an hour 30, hour 40. But if you have time, it was actually a really good watch. But obviously you don't have to take everything seriously. Take it with a grain of salt for some of the things that you see or say or heard said. Because this is from 1998, and you'll see some like old, movies and imagery as well. But try to keep it into the context of the times, right? And try to pick from it the various elements of a Jewish community coming to the United States and trying to incorporate and acculturate and assimilate themselves into being American, but at the same time being in an industry where potentially being too overtly Jewish might have anti-Semitism come back. And especially once they saw that Hitler was rising in Germany, they had to be very careful about like that dynamic. So it was a great watch, so I highly recommend it. Now, let's look at the rise of Zionism as our last kind of discussion point. When I was in university a number of years ago, this was at the forefront of the conversation, and sometimes it still is today, although a little bit less so. So the rise of Zionism is, and if you want to watch that video, it explains it a little bit more in detail, but Zionism is essentially the idea that the Jewish people of the world need a state of Israel. They need their own separate country in order to thrive, right? And it is their ancestral home from the Old Testament. But unfortunately, that has caused an enormous amount of conflict because historically, although the Jews lay claim to the land of Israel from the Testament, right, the Old Testament, and kind of biblical references of that being their land, centuries before World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire held all this territory, and Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims were living all throughout the region. And so suddenly, once the world wars were completed and the Western and American and European powers snapped their fingers and redrew all of the Middle East with arbitrary lines, arbitrarily making Iraq and Kuwait and Jordan and Israel and all these different places, they gave Israel, boom, right, to the Jewish people. And so Zionists around the world were clamoring and saying, yes, finally we're getting our own homeland. However, that, of course, was leading, or especially into the modern day as well, it led to a lot of issues because initially Israel was created to be a two-state country, right? You had the Israelis and you had the Palestinians supposedly, right, living harmoniously together. In recent years, we've seen that Israel has been a bit more aggressive in its expansion and kind of encroaching on some of the kind of Palestinian territories. And a number of years ago, the territory of Gaza had terrorist groups by Hezbollah, right, funded by Iran. And so, from the Israeli territory, what they were seeing was from Gaza, there's like missiles firing at them. So what are you going to do? You're going to fire missiles back. And so this turned into a terrible situation where globally, Israel started to look like the persecutors and the bad guys. Israel started to look like almost like Nazi Germany because Gaza turned into essentially a huge concentration zone where they were blockaded. They were not allowed to trade from the sea. Electricity was cut off, and there was missiles being poured in on them, sometimes hitting civilians. And so the entire world a number of years ago was kind of looking at the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict and saying, "Dear God, what's happening?" And so I'm not sure how this situation is going to unfold. This has been centuries in the making, right? Conflicts between these two religious groups, but hopefully there can be some peace moving forward, right, or a different solution. I don't know what the solution might be, but hopefully there can be one that can get accommodated. Interestingly enough, I also stumbled upon this Vice special. So for some reason, in the United States, in the Southern Bible Belt, evangelical Christians love Israel, and they support Israel immensely. So this is actually an interesting HBO Vice special to watch if you're interested in why the Southern Belt of the United States is so pro-Israel. It's actually pretty cool to watch. So if you have a little bit of time, it'll be worth it. And with that, we are done with the chapter. So hopefully it was a little educational. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully, all of the additional videos you're going to watch, you're going to enjoy them. I really want to thank you for staying here and listening as always. And coming up this week, we're going to be moving on into chapter 7. And so don't forget that discussion questions are due on Sunday as usual. Try to catch up and finish off the readings as much as you can. Review the Google Slides, or thank you for watching this lecture, which is one and the same thing. And have a wonderful week, and I will see you for the next lecture. Take care.